The fluorescent lights in classroom 4C flickered like dying stars as Maya Thornton clutched the worn tactical manual that would change everything. Outside, the October rain hammered against the tall windows with a fury that seemed to match her racing heartbeat. She wasn't supposed to be here. Elementary school teachers didn't get recruited by special operations units. They graded papers, managed classrooms full of energetic children, and went home to quiet apartments with cats who judged them silently from windowsills. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here she was, her worn leather messenger bag, the same one she'd carried into 1,000 different classrooms over 10 years, sitting heavy against her hip, filled not with lesson plans and red pens, but with documents. Documents that could save lives. Documents that could change the course of a high-stakes operation. The military base's entrance had been slippery with rain and fallen leaves when she'd climbed them an hour ago, each step feeling like she was ascending towards some inevitable collision with destiny. The security guard, a stern-faced man named Sergeant Peterson, who reminded Maya of her own father, had smiled warmly as she passed through the metal detector. "First time visiting the compound, Miss Thornton?" he'd asked, and Maya had nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Now sitting on the cold metal bench outside the briefing room, Maya's fingers traced the edge of the tactical manual. Inside were notes, dozens of them taken with her ancient fountain pen over the past 10 months. Notes on language patterns, cultural nuances, and regional dialects that told stories no intelligence officer had been able to decipher. Notes on the subtleties of communication that she'd learned through years of teaching children from diverse backgrounds. The folder also contained her daily logs written in the careful handwriting she'd perfected during her teaching credential program 12 years ago. Each entry documented what she'd observed, what she'd learned, and what she'd been asked to interpret. May 15th, analyzed communication patterns in intercepted messages. When I brought my findings to Captain Reynolds, he told me to focus on basic translations, not strategic analysis. June 2nd, identified dialectical markers that suggested the target was from a different region than previously thought. Intelligence officers said they'd consider it next month. The door to the briefing room opened with a heavy thud, and a woman in crisp military fatigues emerged, her boots clicking sharply against the polished floor. Behind her walked a man Maya recognized from newspaper photos, General James Mitchell, whose stern face had graced military publications and national security briefings for the better part of a decade. He looked different now, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something tighter, more cautious. His eyes swept the hallway and landed on Maya for just a moment. There was no recognition there, of course. Why would there be? She was just an elementary school teacher, another civilian consultant in the military machine he commanded. Maya's phone buzzed softly in her purse. A text from Layla Patel, her only real friend at the Language Institute and the linguist who'd first encouraged her to speak up. "You don't have to do this alone," the message read. "David and I are in the hallway if you need us." Maya smiled despite her nerves. Layla had been teaching Persian at the Institute for 8 years and David Chen had been there for 15. They'd both seen what Maya had seen, but they had permanent positions to protect, families to feed, mortgages to pay. Maya with her month-to-month teaching contract and studio apartment had less to lose. Or so she told herself. The truth was more complicated, as truth usually was. Maya had spent 10 years building relationships with students whose names she'd never forget. 10 years of being the steady presence when children from diplomatic families and international corporations moved into the district. She'd been there for their first day in an American school, for their struggles with a new language, for the quiet moments when a child needed someone who understood both words and the silence between them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The children knew her voice, trusted her smile, counted on her to remember their native languages and their fears about the English test next week. Now, sitting in this military compound with its imposing barriers and stern-faced soldiers, Maya wondered if she was about to throw it all away. The folder in her hands contained linguistic analysis of intercepted communications, dialectical anomalies, and cultural context clues that reached to the highest levels of a terrorist organization. But it also contained the end of her teaching career, at least in the quiet Virginia suburb where she'd built her life. The briefing room door opened again, and this time a young man in combat fatigues emerged. Lieutenant Commander Alex Rivera. She'd researched him online, found articles about his previous deployments involving high-risk extraction operations. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s with intense eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. He spotted her immediately and approached with a respectful nod. "Miss Thornton, I'm Lieutenant Commander Rivera. Thank you so much for coming today." He settled onto the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance. "I know this isn't easy. What you're doing takes tremendous courage." Maya's laugh was more bitter than she'd intended. "Courage? I'm terrified. I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong." "Tell me about that," he said, and something in his tone reminded her of her favorite professor in graduate school. The one who'd taught her that good teaching started with good listening. "I've been a language teacher for 10 years, Maya began, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Do you know what that means?" "It means I've never belonged anywhere except in that space between cultures. I'm the person they call when a diplomat's child arrives from overseas. I'm the person who walks into chaos and tries to create understanding, then returns to my classroom again. I've taught Arabic and Farsi and Pashto to military personnel and Russian and Mandarin to intelligence analysts, sometimes in the same week. I've helped children navigate new cultures and adults navigate dangerous territories." She paused, watching a young officer exit the elevator, dressed in formal uniform that looked like it had been pressed for this specific occasion. His posture was rigid with tension, and Maya wondered what crisis had brought him here, what truths he was about to tell or hear. "The thing about being a language teacher," she continued, "is that you see things differently. Translators get used to words, to syntax, to the formal structures. They adapt. But when you're moving between languages, between cultures, you notice patterns. You see connections." Lieutenant Commander Rivera nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "What kinds of patterns?" Maya opened her folder and withdrew a transcript. It showed an intercepted communication that intelligence analysts had translated months ago. The image captured phrases and expressions that had been flagged as suspicious but ultimately dismissed as irrelevant chatter. "This was from 3 months ago," she said, handing him the paper. "The translation is technically correct, but it misses the cultural context. These aren't just casual conversations. They're using a regional dialect from a specific mountain province, and they're embedding coded language within seemingly innocent phrases about family gatherings." She pulled out another transcript, this one from a different source. "This is from a supposedly separate cell. See this phrasing? It's identical in structure but uses different key terms. When I mapped these communications against regional language patterns, I found something striking. These aren't separate groups at all. They're the same operation using a communication strategy based on old tribal storytelling patterns." The transcripts kept coming, each one revealing a small piece of a larger puzzle. Communications that seemed unrelated when translated literally, but formed a cohesive operational plan when viewed through the lens of cultural context and regional storytelling traditions. "But it wasn't just the language," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "It was the timing. Messages sent during significant cultural holidays carried different meanings than those sent on ordinary days. References to family traditions weren't just covered, they were part of the code." Lieutenant Commander Rivera was writing quickly now, occasionally looking up to meet her eyes. "How did you gain access to these communications?" "Language teachers aren't typically included in intelligence analysis." Maya smiled for the first time since entering the compound. "That's where being underestimated becomes an advantage. People forget I understand multiple dialects. I've served as a translator in meetings where officials thought I only spoke one language. I've organized documents and transcripts while analysts discuss things they probably shouldn't have discussed in front of a teacher. I've been treated like furniture so often that I learned to listen like furniture, quietly, constantly, and without judgment. And that's how you discover the North Star situation. The smile faded from Maya's face. North Star, the operation that had started all of this, that had transformed her from a quiet language teacher into a military compound whistleblower. She'd been assigned as a cultural consultant for what was supposed to be a 2-week advisory role on a humanitarian mission. 2 weeks had turned into 2 months as the operation grew increasingly complex. North Star involved a high-value target in a remote mountain region, surrounded by villages with complex tribal affiliations and centuries-old conflicts. 93% of the intelligence came from intercepted communications that had been translated by analysts with formal training but limited cultural understanding. Many decisions were being made based on literal translations that missed crucial context. Planning was proceeding based on assumptions about local cooperation that Maya knew were dangerously flawed. Maya had fallen in love with languages the way some people fall in love with stray animals, completely, protectively, and with full knowledge that heartbreak was inevitable. Every new language opened doors to worlds most people never saw, revealed truths most analysts never understood. North Star was different, she said quietly. The operational plan was based on a critical misunderstanding. The dialect being used by the target wasn't what they thought. With all the resources at their disposal, how did they get it so wrong? Lieutenant Commander Rivera asked. Maya's hands tightened on the folder. The communications were being analyzed by formal linguistics protocols focusing on grammar, syntax, vocabulary. But they were missing the cultural context completely. The target was using an obscure mountain dialect with storytelling patterns that date back centuries. His communications weren't just giving operational instructions, they were embedding them in cultural narratives that the analysts were dismissing as irrelevant details. She pulled out a transcript that showed communications between the target and his network. See this passage about a wedding celebration? It's not actually about a wedding. It's using an ancient folk tale structure to communicate rendezvous points. And this discussion about harvest? It's using agricultural metaphors to discuss weapons shipments. But the worst part was the extraction plan. Maya said simply, remembering what happened during mission planning. The operational team believed they had identified a secure extraction route based on communications with a local asset. But the translation missed crucial context clues. The asset wasn't confirming the route was secure, he was trying to warn them about a trap. Lieutenant Commander Rivera looked up from his notes. And you documented all of this? Maya nodded. Every day I started taking notes as evidence for intelligence reports that never got proper attention. Then I started documenting because I realized someone needed to understand that these weren't just words on paper, they were lives at stake, they were people who existed, who mattered, who deserved better understanding. The briefing room door opened once more and this time an officer emerged. Miss Thornton, they're ready for you. Maya stood on legs that suddenly felt unsteady. The folder trembled in her hands and she realized she was holding not just evidence but the hopes of dozens of soldiers who would be deployed based on her linguistic insights. Lieutenant Commander Rivera stood beside her. One more question before we go in. Why did you decide to come forward now? What was the final straw? Maya closed her eyes and immediately she was back at the Language Institute on a Tuesday morning in March. She was reviewing intercepts related to North Star, helping analysts understand cultural references in communications about regional power structures, tribal allegiances, and local traditions that might impact the operation. A young analyst named Ryan had raised his hand and asked with the kind of pure trust that only inexperienced officers possessed, Miss Thornton, why don't they listen when we tell them the translation isn't quite right? Don't they want us to get this right? Maya had looked into those earnest eyes and realized she had no answer that wouldn't break this young man's faith in the system. That night, she'd gone home to her quiet apartment and called her former student, now Captain Jessica Reynolds, for the first time. An analyst asked me why no one cared enough to get the translations right, Maya said quietly. And I realized I couldn't answer that question until I'd done everything I could to make sure they did. The officer was waiting patiently and Maya could hear voices from inside the briefing room. Commanders preparing. intelligence officers adjusting their presentations, special operators preparing to either succeed or fail based once again on information they couldn't verify firsthand. Maya Thornton, language teacher, invisible woman, keeper of cultural secrets and linguistic nuances, took a deep breath and walked through the door that would change everything. Maya's journey to this military compound had begun not with a moment of heroic decision, but with 1,000 small realizations that eventually became unbearable. As she settled into the chair at the briefing table and looked out at the assembled team of operators, intelligence analysts, and commanders, she could see the faces of every person who had shaped her path to this moment. But to understand how she'd arrived here, one needed to understand the woman she'd been before, the careful, quiet professional who'd spent 10 years perfecting the art of linguistic bridge building. Maya Thornton had never planned to be a language teacher working with military personnel. Like most things in her life, it had happened by accident. A temporary solution that became permanent through a combination of circumstance and an inability to disappoint people who needed her. She'd graduated from Georgetown with a master's in linguistics and dreams of working for the United Nations, filled with idealism about fostering international understanding through language. But UN positions had been scarce when she graduated, and teaching at an international school offered immediate income and the promise of eventual diplomatic connections. Just for a year or two, she'd told herself, moving into a studio apartment in a quiet Virginia suburb, a working-class area where rent was affordable and her neighbors included military families, embassy staff, and intelligence personnel who valued the proximity to D.C., without the district's price tag. That was 10 years ago. The studio apartment had become home, filled with books in 23 languages she'd studied to varying degrees of fluency, artwork given to her by students who remembered her years after she taught them, and a desk where she prepared lessons every night, creating custom materials for children who needed to learn English while maintaining their native languages and cultural identities. Maya's typical morning began at 5:30 a.m., with her alarm buzzing beside her bed. She'd rise immediately, no snooze button, a habit formed during her childhood with a father who'd served in military intelligence and considered punctuality a moral virtue. She kept a teaching bag packed with supplies, flashcards in multiple languages, picture dictionaries, cultural reference materials, a folder of emergency lesson plans for every language and age level she taught, and a small digital recorder that had originally been for documenting student pronunciations but had evolved into something more important. Her morning routine was a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency. Shower, coffee, yogurt and fruit eaten while reviewing the day's lessons and checking news from regions related to her students' home countries. She kept a color-coded calendar on her refrigerator. Blue for elementary school classes, green for adult language courses at the institute, red for private tutoring sessions with diplomatic staff or military personnel. Some weeks her calendar looked like a rainbow. The drive to each assignment was an exercise in mental preparation. Maya reviewed vocabulary lists mentally, planned cultural context explanations, and prepared herself to switch between languages and teaching approaches depending on her audience. She could predict which students would need extra attention, which concepts would require careful cultural framing, which military personnel would resist learning the cultural context behind the words they were memorizing. Walking into a classroom each day meant becoming an instant linguistic detective. Maya would listen carefully to pronunciations, to the way students constructed sentences, to the cultural references they used unconsciously. She developed an ear not just for grammatical errors but for the subtle markers that revealed exactly which region a person came from, which social class they belonged to, which cultural traditions shaped their understanding of the world. The children were always her first priority. But Maya had developed a secondary skill over the years, the ability to read between the lines of the materials she was given to teach adult classes at the language institute that served military and intelligence personnel. She could determine which languages were suddenly in demand, which regions were becoming operational priorities, which cultural contexts were being overlooked in the rush to train personnel for deployment. It was this skill that had made her valuable as more than just a language instructor. Intelligence officers began requesting her specifically, knowing that Maya Thornton could provide cultural context that formal translators often missed. But being perpetually between worlds meant living in a constant state of divided loyalty. Maya never knew if she was serving the needs of her students or the objectives of operations she wasn't supposed to know existed. She kept a mental library of cultural misunderstandings, diplomatic incidents, and military miscalculations that had resulted from poor translations or missing context. Her apartment reflected this professional dedication. The bookshelves contained grammar texts next to cultural histories, dialectical dictionaries beside books of regional folk tales, military language guides alongside children's stories from the same regions. Her closet held outfits appropriate for teaching elementary school children on one side and professional attire for briefing military personnel on the other. She'd learned to move between worlds with practiced ease, knowing that some contexts required warm approachability while others demanded crisp professionalism. The emotional toll of this lifestyle was something Maya rarely discussed, even with Layla and David, who'd become her closest friends at the Institute. How do you explain the exhaustion of building bridges between cultures that often didn't want to understand each other? How do you describe the loneliness of living between worlds, never fully belonging to either? How do you talk about the frustration of seeing miscommunications that you're not in a position to correct? Maya had developed coping mechanisms over the years. She kept a journal where she wrote about particularly meaningful connections she'd helped forge, preserving memories of moments when genuine understanding had been achieved across linguistic and cultural divides. She volunteered at a refugee center on Saturday mornings, helping new arrivals navigate the complexities of American culture, watching their faces light up when they recognized words from their homeland in her careful pronunciation. She maintained correspondence with several former students who had moved back to their home countries or graduated to diplomatic positions, following their progress through letters and emails that reminded her why language mattered. But the nature of language teaching also meant witnessing things that others might miss or choose to ignore. Maya saw the same misunderstandings recurring in intelligence briefings, the same cultural blindness affecting operations throughout regions where she had expertise. A mistranslated phrase in one operation would echo similar errors she'd seen in 3 others. An intelligence assessment based on literal translation would miss cultural contexts she recognized from previous failures. A planning session that ignored regional customs would remind her of past disasters that could have been avoided with proper cultural understanding. Maya's breaking point hadn't come dramatically. Instead, it had been an accumulation of small warnings that finally exceeded her capacity for professional silence. The morning she'd arrived at the Language Institute to find that cultural context training had been suspended due to operational time constraints while analysts were still being expected to make assessments based on literal translations. The afternoon she'd stayed late to help a young intelligence officer understand dialectical variations, only to discover that his reports were being summarized in ways that stripped them of crucial cultural nuances. The day she'd opened a briefing packet and found it filled with translations that missed obvious coded language because the analysts had been looking for technical terms rather than cultural references. Each incident had been like a small stone added to a growing pile, invisible to most observers but increasingly heavy for the person carrying the weight. Maya had begun taking notes almost unconsciously, initially just as documentation for her own teaching preparations or translation corrections that never seemed to be incorporated into official assessments. But gradually, she realized she was creating an archive of systematic blindness, a linguistic record of how cultural ignorance was shaping military operations and intelligence assessments. Her notebook became her constant companion, hidden in her teaching bag alongside the usual supplies. She documented mistranslations and missed cultural references, operational assumptions based on flawed understandings of regional dialects, intelligence assessments that ignored the storytelling traditions embedded in intercepted communications. Each entry told a story about what was being missed, what was being misunderstood, what was being ignored. Maya's evenings were spent organizing these notes, writing detailed explanations that included dialectical variations, cultural contexts, and historical references. She created folders on her laptop with names like Southern Regional Dialects, Tribal Communication Patterns, and Cultural Context Markers. She told herself she was being thorough, professional, responsible. She didn't admit even to herself that she was building a case. The transition from documentation to action had been gradual and then sudden, like many life changes. Maya had started by mentioning problematic translations to intelligence officers, suggesting alternative interpretations, offering to provide cultural context for assessment teams. When those conversations led nowhere, she'd begun submitting written analyses, creating paper trails of her concerns and the responses, or lack thereof, she received. When officers stopped responding to her reports, she'd started documenting their lack of response. It was during this process that Maya discovered the depth of the systemic problem. Operational plans accidentally left on printers revealed decisions being made based on translations she knew were fundamentally flawed. Conversations overheard in hallways revealed assessments that ignored cultural contexts she tried repeatedly to explain. Phone calls transferred to her line by mistake connected her with discussions of operations that were proceeding based on misunderstandings she'd warned about months earlier. Maya's kitchen table had become a command center of evidence covered with transcripts, translations, cultural reference materials, and contact information for officers and officials who might care about getting things right before lives were lost. She'd researched the chain of command, studied operational protocols, and learned the names of every key decision-maker involved in regional operations. She'd prepared for this moment without consciously deciding to prepare, gathering the tools she'd need to fight a battle she'd never planned to join. The decision to contact Captain Jessica Reynolds, a former student now working in special operations, had come on a Tuesday evening in March. After a particularly troubling day at the Language Institute, Maya had been trying to help intelligence analysts understand subtle differences in regional expressions when she'd noticed that their assessment report completely ignored her input, proceeding with an operational plan based on a fundamental misreading of the target's communications. A closer examination of the plan revealed that a Delta Force team would be deployed based on intelligence that Maya knew was being misinterpreted. When she'd mentioned this to her supervisor, she'd been told that operational decisions were above her security clearance and that she should focus on teaching language basics, not questioning intelligence assessments. That evening, Maya had researched the implications of what she'd seen and realized she was witnessing not just linguistic negligence but potential danger to the operational team. She'd looked at the notes she'd taken of mistranslated communications and realized she was documenting not just errors but potential loss of life. She'd sat at her kitchen table surrounded by evidence of systemic failure and finally acknowledged what she'd been avoiding. She was the only one in a position to speak for soldiers who would be deployed based on flawed intelligence. She was the only civilian who'd seen the full scope of the problem, who had documented the pattern of cultural blindness, who had both the evidence and the expertise to act without being constrained by the chain of command. The phone call to Captain Reynolds had been terrifying and liberating simultaneously. Maya had rehearsed what she'd say, prepared for skepticism or dismissal. Instead, she'd reached a former student who remembered her emphasis on cultural context and who had the operational experience to understand exactly what the risks were. Reynolds had listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and scheduled a meeting with her commanding officer for the following week. Now, sitting at the briefing table with a room full of Delta Force operators and intelligence officers waiting for her assessment, Maya felt the weight of every note in her folder, every mistranslation in her documentation, every soldier whose life might depend on her ability to make these people understand what they were missing. She thought about her quiet apartment, her color-coded calendar, her carefully organized life of cultural mediation and linguistic bridge building. She thought about Ryan's question, why don't they listen when we tell them the translation isn't quite right? And realized that she was about to become a different kind of translator, one who refused to accept that cultural understanding was someone else's responsibility. Maya looked out at the assembled team, took a breath that seemed to pull in 10 years of preparation, and prepared to tell the truth that would change everything. The questioning began firmly as General Mitchell established Maya's credentials and expertise. But as her testimony unfolded, the atmosphere in the briefing room grew increasingly tense. Maya could feel the weight of skeptical eyes from senior intelligence officers whose careers had been built on the very analytical framework she was now challenging. Ms. Thornton, General Mitchell continued, holding up one of her transcripts, can you explain specifically what you observed in the North Star communications on March 15 of this year? Maya's hands remained steady as she identified the document showing communications between the target and his regional commanders. This exchange appears to be discussing agricultural supplies on the surface, but the dialect markers and storytelling structure reveal it's actually detailing weapons movements. The reference to planting season isn't about crops, it's using an ancient tribal metaphor about sowing iron in the earth to describe laying explosives along the very route your team plans to use. Did you report this interpretation to intelligence personnel? Mitchell asked. Yes, I spoke with the regional analysis team immediately. They acknowledged my linguistic expertise but explained that operational decisions had already progressed too far to incorporate new interpretations. They told me the extraction route had been verified through multiple sources. But you persisted, Mitchell stated, not quite a question. I did, Maya answered. Because the sources confirming the route were all being filtered through the same flawed translation framework. It wasn't multiple confirmations, it was multiple versions of the same misinterpretation. Defense Intelligence Director Rebecca Sterling rose smoothly from her chair. With all due respect, General, Ms. Thornton is speculating beyond her expertise. Cultural context is valuable but doesn't supersede established intelligence protocols. Colonel James Harris, the Delta Force commander whose team would be executing the operation, barely looked up from his tablet. Let her finish. The analyst is providing context that might save my men's lives. Maya watched this exchange with interest. She'd researched Colonel Harris extensively, learning that he'd lost 3 operators on a previous mission due to faulty intelligence, that he had a reputation for prioritizing ground truth over institutional procedure. She hoped this background would make him more receptive to her assessment, but she also knew that military hierarchy meant she couldn't count on his support alone. The transcripts continued, each one building a case for systematic misinterpretation that extended far beyond North Star. Maya described analyzing communications from a tribal region where intelligence analysts had identified what they believed were separate terrorist cells, only to discover through linguistic patterns that they were actually discussing a unified strategy using dialectical variations to disguise their coordination. Ms. Thornton, General Mitchell said, pulling out a thick folder. Did you also document operational vulnerabilities during your time at the Institute? This was the moment Maya had both dreaded and anticipated. The linguistic evidence was concerning enough, but the operational vulnerabilities she had identified could potentially result in mission failure and lost lives. Yes, she replied, her voice growing stronger. I began to notice discrepancies between what was being reported in operational briefs and what I was observing in the actual communications. Maya described attending a planning session where the operational team had presented what they believed was definitive intelligence about the target's movements based on communications with a local asset. The presentation included maps showing safe houses, patrol patterns, and security measures that looked like solid intelligence. Did you recognize the flaws in this assessment? General Mitchell asked. Some of them immediately, yes. The communications from the asset weren't confirming security details, they were using regional storytelling patterns that actually warned of danger. But the warnings were embedded in cultural references that the analysts missed completely. Maya pulled out her own translations showing the same communications with cultural context annotations. The asset wasn't confirming that a particular building was a safe extraction point, he was using a local folktale about a wolf's den to warn that it was a trap. I started researching operational plans, Maya continued. Public briefings showed that operational planning was proceeding based on these misinterpretations. I found mission parameters that relied on local cooperation from tribal leaders who were actually signaling resistance through cultural references in their communications. The testimony grew more detailed as Maya described discovering assessment reports that classified regional dialects as standardized language variants, missing crucial distinctions that changed meanings completely. She'd found intelligence briefs that interpreted traditional storytelling patterns as random chatter, missing the embedded operational instructions that local fighters would understand implicitly. Intelligence Director Sterling began objecting more frequently as Maya's testimony became more specific. General, this civilian lacks the operational security clearance to make these assessments. Maya felt a flash of irritation. I may be a language teacher, but I have a master's degree in linguistics with a specialization in dialectical variations and cultural storytelling patterns. I've completed advanced training in regional cultural analysis. I'm not unqualified to read between the lines. Colonel Harris allowed himself a small smile. Objection noted, Director Sterling. The analyst may continue. The turning point in Maya's testimony came when General Mitchell asked her to describe the specific communications regarding the North Star extraction route. Maya's composure, which had remained steady throughout hours of questioning, finally showed cracks as she recalled what she'd analyzed. I was reviewing communications related to regional movement patterns again. The operation had been planned based on intelligence that a particular mountain pass was under the control of a tribal leader sympathetic to our interests. The communications seemed to confirm this on the surface. Maya paused, remembering. During a final review, I was marking dialectical variations in the asset's messages when I noticed something critical. The asset was using a storytelling pattern from the region, a structure we call reversal narration, where the true meaning is the opposite of the literal words when certain phrases are used. What happened next? Mitchell asked. About 2 days later, I received additional communications to translate. The asset was using increasingly complex cultural references that would be obvious to locals but virtually invisible to outsiders. I watched him shift from direct warnings that were being missed to cultural storytelling that was even more obscure. Maya's voice grew quieter as she continued. That afternoon during final review, I identified a complete operational map hidden within what appeared to be casual references to local landmarks and family connections. When properly translated with cultural context, it revealed an ambush plan positioned along the exact extraction route your team planned to use. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air like a physical presence. Special operators could have been seriously injured or killed because of cultural blindness and analytical indifference. Miss Thornton, General Mitchell said gently, what did you do after making this discovery? I went home and called everyone I could reach in the chain of command. I submitted formal warnings to 3 different intelligence officers. I documented everything with translations and cultural reference notes. I highlighted specific threats and mapped them against the planned operation. And what was the response? Maya's laugh was bitter. I was told that as a language teacher, I wasn't authorized to question operational planning. I was told that mission parameters were outside my expertise. I was told that if I continued to overstep my role, my consulting contract wouldn't be renewed. The briefing room erupted in murmurs at this revelation. General Mitchell called for order, but Maya could see that her testimony was having an impact. Several officers were reviewing her documents rapidly, and she noticed Lieutenant Commander Rivera making notes with growing urgency. General Mitchell moved to a new line of questioning, asking Maya to describe the broader implications of the systemic blindness she'd identified. Maya testified about operations that had failed due to cultural misunderstandings. Missions compromised by misinterpreted signals. Assets who'd been burned because their cultural warnings had been missed. Opportunities lost because intelligence analysts didn't recognize when local leaders were extending cooperation through traditional communication patterns. I kept a record, Maya said, pulling out a notebook she'd maintained throughout her documentation. Instances where cultural context would have changed operational outcomes. By my count, at least 12 major operations in the past 2 years have been compromised by linguistic and cultural blindness. Maya described meeting Captain Thomas Reed, a special operator who'd been injured during an extraction gone wrong in the same region. His team had entered a village based on intelligence that the local elder had indicated it was safe, only to discover that the cultural context of the elder's communication had been completely misunderstood. When she'd finally gotten a doctor's note certifying her regional expertise to review the original communications, she was told the operational assessment took precedence over linguistic analysis. She testified about Lieutenant Sarachin, an intelligence analyst who'd identified similar dialectical anomalies in target communications but had been overruled because her cultural interpretations didn't fit the established assessment framework. Lieutenant Chen's analysis had been dismissed, her career sidetracked, and her warnings ignored until an operation failed exactly as she had predicted. Maya's voice grew stronger as she described these individual cases, each one representing an operator whose safety had been compromised by cultural blindness. She talked about military linguists who used their leave time to gain better cultural understanding of their regions, intelligence officers who worked unpaid overtime trying to incorporate cultural context into their analyses, commanders who made life-or-death decisions based on translations they couldn't verify themselves. These are dedicated professionals trying to complete impossible missions, Maya testified. They're performing their duties with extraordinary courage, but they shouldn't have to operate blind to cultural context. No operator should have to choose between following intelligence assessments and trusting their instincts about cultural realities on the ground. The cross-examination by Intelligence Director Sterling was aggressive and personal. Sterling attempted to portray Maya as an academic overstepping her boundaries, questioning her motives, her security clearance, and her right to speak on operational matters. "Miss Thornton," Sterling began, her tone sharp. "Isn't it true that you've never been granted full operational clearance for North Star?" "That's correct." "And isn't it possible that your testimony today is motivated by academic arrogance rather than genuine concern for operational success?" Maya met Sterling's gaze directly. "I've been a linguistic and cultural consultant by choice for 10 years. I've had opportunities for full intelligence positions, but I chose the flexibility of teaching because it allowed me to work with more languages, more cultural contexts, and more diverse regional variations than I could access in a conventional intelligence role. But surely you must feel some resentment about your professional situation." "The only resentment I feel," Maya replied, her voice steady, "is about operational planners who have the power to protect their teams, but choose to ignore cultural context that could save lives. I've spent 10 years watching intelligence officers prioritize procedure over understanding. That's what motivates my testimony, not personal grievance, but professional responsibility." Sterling pressed harder, challenging Maya's methodology, questioning the representativeness of her cultural interpretations, suggesting that she'd selectively focused on problems while ignoring successful operations. "Miss Thornton," Sterling continued, "isn't it true that you've never documented any successful applications of cultural understanding in military operations?" Maya pulled out another folder, this one noticeably thicker than the first. "Actually, I have extensive documentation of what works, and that makes the failures even more inexcusable." She described reviewing communications from Operation Sandstorm, where proper cultural context had created an intelligence breakthrough that led to the successful extraction of hostages. Accurate understanding of regional dialects and storytelling patterns had allowed operators to identify exactly which tribal leaders were extending genuine cooperation and which were using cultural signals to communicate deception. "The difference wasn't the operators or the assets," Maya testified. "The operators in failed missions are just as dedicated as those in successful ones. The assets are just as genuine in their efforts to help. The difference is understanding. The difference is respect for cultural context. The difference is that some teams matter more than others in operational planning priorities." Sterling's next line of attack focused on Maya's methods of gathering information. "Ms. Thornton, did you have authorization to review classified operational plans?" "I never accessed documents I wasn't cleared to see as part of my consulting role. Most of my documentation was based on materials I was specifically asked to translate or provide cultural context for." "But you admit to making copies of communications and other operational materials." Maya felt the familiar anger rising in her chest. "I documented my own work in the translations I provided. If operational plans based on those translations were proceeding despite my warnings about cultural misinterpretations, that's part of the problem I'm testifying about." "So, you admit to essentially spying on military operations?" "I admit to paying attention when lives were at stake based on my translations. I admit to caring enough to document what I saw and heard. I admit to believing that operators deserve the full cultural context of the environments they're being sent into." The back and forth continued for nearly 2 hours with Sterling attacking Maya's credibility while Maya defended not just her actions but her right to advocate for operators who deserved better intelligence. The briefing room audience shifted restlessly, and Maya could see that military sentiment was clearly on her side. During a brief recess, Maya stepped into the hallway and was surrounded by supporters. Layla and David hugged her tightly, concern in their eyes. "You're doing this for all of us," Layla whispered. "For every linguist who's ever felt helpless watching operations proceed based on bad translations." A man Maya didn't recognize approached hesitantly. "Miss Thornton, I'm Captain Reed, the operator you mentioned. I just wanted to thank you for remembering what happened to my team, for including our story. It means everything to know that someone was paying attention." More officers gathered around Maya during the break, sharing their own stories of cultural misunderstandings and analytical blindness. Lieutenant James Parker, whose team had operated in the northern provinces, described trying for months to get intelligence officers to understand the cultural signals they were observing on the ground. "They kept telling us the translations were accurate, but the reactions we got from locals told a different story," he explained. "My team survived because our point man grew up with an Iranian grandmother and recognized the cultural cues our intelligence briefs were missing." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Johnson talked about her team's frustration when trying to build rapport with local assets, only to discover that the cultural briefings they'd received had fundamentally misunderstood regional honor codes and tribal allegiances. "The same week we lost an asset because of cultural blindness, headquarters announced new commendations for the intelligence team that had prepared our regional briefs," she said bitterly. Maya listened to each story, recognizing the pattern she documented across operations. Operators who understood the ground reality but lacked the institutional influence to change analytical frameworks. Intelligence officers who wanted to provide better cultural context but feared for their career advancement. Assets whose lives were at risk but had learned their warnings would be misinterpreted. When the briefing reconvened, General Mitchell called his next witness, Colonel James Harris, the Delta Force commander whose team would be executing the North Star operation. Maya watched as Colonel Harris approached the front of the room with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years in special operations. The dignity of a leader who'd lost men to bad intelligence and was determined never to repeat that experience. Harris's testimony provided operational context for everything Maya had documented. He confirmed the intelligence gaps, the cultural blindness, and the institutional resistance to incorporating cultural context into operational planning. "Miss Thornton's cultural analysis is the missing piece we've been looking for," Colonel Harris testified. "In fact, her translations and cultural interpretations explain anomalies my team has been reporting from the ground for months. She noticed patterns that our standard analysis frameworks simply aren't designed to detect." General Mitchell asked Colonel Harris to describe his interactions with intelligence personnel about the North Star operation. "I've submitted 17 formal requests for enhanced cultural analysis in the past year," he replied. "I've attended every operational planning session, raising concerns about dialectical variations and regional cultural factors that might affect our mission. I've written detailed assessments, provided on-the-ground observations from my operators, and requested specialized linguistic support beyond standard translation protocols." "What has been the response?" Mitchell asked. Colonel Harris's professional composure cracked slightly. "I've been told repeatedly that our concerns are noted but that approved intelligence protocols take precedence over field observations, that I need to trust the established analytical framework. When I've pressed for specific reconsideration of cultural factors, I've been told that questioning approved intelligence assessments undermines operational cohesion and that the chain of command exists for a reason." The threat was implicit but clear. Harris had been warned that continued advocacy for cultural understanding could damage his career, leaving his operators without their most experienced commander. Maya watched this testimony with growing resolve. Colonel Harris represented everything good about special operations leadership. A commander who put his team first. Who fought tirelessly for better intelligence. Who refused to accept that operational protocols should override ground truth. The fact that intelligence leadership had essentially threatened him for doing his job revealed the depth of institutional blindness. The next witness was David Chen, Maya's friend and a 15-year veteran linguist. David's testimony focused on the impact of cultural blindness on intelligence analysis. I've worked in this field long enough to see the gradual deterioration of cultural understanding in operational planning, David testified. Budget constraints always seem to affect cultural training while technical surveillance capabilities multiply. We're asked to provide faster translations with less cultural context every year while watching millions of dollars spent on systems that collect more information than we have the cultural framework to properly interpret. David described the frustration of trying to explain dialectical variations to intelligence officers with rigid analytical frameworks, of attempting to incorporate cultural storytelling patterns into assessments designed for technical language processing, of watching talented linguists leave the field because they couldn't bear the responsibility of seeing their translations misused in ways that put operators at risk. Ms. Thornton documented what many of us have experienced but felt powerless to address, David continued. She gave voice to problems that affect operations every day. Under cross-examination, Defense Intelligence Director Sterling tried to suggest that linguistic complaints were routine in every intelligence operation, that time constraints were a reality of military planning, that the witnesses were exaggerating problems for dramatic effect. David's response was swift and pointed. I've worked with 3 different intelligence agencies over my career. Time constraints are real everywhere, but deliberate indifference to cultural context is not. There's a difference between doing your best with limited resources and ignoring warnings until they become dangers. The afternoon brought testimony from Dr. James Rivera, a cultural anthropologist who'd been contacted about Maya's concerns. Dr. Rivera's credentials were impeccable: 30 years of experience in the target region, recognition as an expert witness in counterterrorism cases, a reputation for thorough and impartial assessment. Based on my review of Ms. Thornton's cultural interpretations and 3 other operations in the region, Dr. Rivera testified, I found multiple instances where critical cultural context was missed in ways that compromised operational security. These are not minor translation issues. These are fundamental misunderstandings that pose immediate risks to operator safety. Dr. Rivera's report was damning. He documented communication patterns that revealed operational security had been compromised, cultural signals that had been misinterpreted as cooperation, tribal dynamics that had been fundamentally misunderstood in ways that undermine the entire operational premise. In my professional opinion, he concluded, the North Star operation as currently planned should be immediately redesigned based on proper cultural context. The fact that operators are preparing to deploy based on these misinterpretations represents a clear and present danger to the team. The briefing room fell silent as the implications of this testimony settled over the audience. Maya felt vindicated but also horrified. Her documentation had been conservative compared to what a professional assessment had revealed. The day's final witness was unexpected. Captain Jessica Reynolds, Maya's former student and the officer she'd first contacted, had returned early from deployment specifically to testify. Captain Reynolds had been working to integrate cultural intelligence into special operations planning for years. The military has received approximately $47 million for enhanced cultural and linguistic training over the past 3 years, she testified. These funds were specifically allocated for incorporating cultural context into operational planning, improving dialectical analysis capabilities, and enhancing regional understanding. However, our investigation shows that less than 30% of these funds reached actual training programs or field operations. The majority was spent on technical systems, AI translation development, and what can only be described as institutional overhead. Maya watched Intelligence Director Sterling's face as these figures were presented. Her confident demeanor had disappeared entirely, replaced by the pale complexion of someone realizing that their carefully constructed framework was crumbling. Captain Reynolds continued with specific examples. $200,000 spent on an automated translation system that couldn't recognize dialectical variations while cultural sensitivity training for operators was cut. $185,000 spent on technical monitoring capabilities while requests for embedded cultural analysts were denied. $150,000 in development costs for an AI system that missed the exact cultural patterns Ms. Thornton identified manually. Ms. Thornton's documentation provided the human context for what our financial investigation revealed, Captain Reynolds testified. She connected technical assessment failures to real operators facing real consequences. Without her courage in coming forward, these institutional blind spots might have continued indefinitely. As the day's testimony concluded, Maya felt emotionally drained but professionally vindicated. She'd spent 10 years watching problems that seemed insurmountable, feeling powerless to create meaningful change. Today, she'd learned that her careful documentation had provided the foundation for a case that could transform how operations were planned, but she also knew that tomorrow would bring retaliation, challenges, and the personal cost of speaking truth to power. As she gathered her folders and prepared to leave the briefing room, Maya realized that her life as an invisible language teacher was over. What would come next remained uncertain, but she was no longer the same woman who'd walked into this building that morning. The quiet professional who'd spent 10 years perfecting the art of being linguistically essential had become operationally visible, and there was no going back. The morning of Maya's second day of testimony began with news that would reshape everything. As she sat in her apartment drinking coffee and reviewing her notes, her phone rang with a call from Lieutenant Commander Rivera. "Maya, have you seen the morning briefing?" His voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard before. "No, I've been preparing for today's session." "Why?" "The Joint Chiefs reviewed yesterday's testimony overnight. They've ordered an immediate reassessment of all regional operations. The Pentagon sent representatives this morning. The North Star operation has been paused for complete redesign." Maya turned on her television to find her name appearing in a classified bulletin she wasn't supposed to have access to. A notification marked urgent that had been circulated throughout Special Operations Command, ordering immediate review of all intelligence incorporating her cultural context methodology. The bulletin was calling her the civilian linguist who exposed critical intelligence vulnerabilities. The report showed commanders from multiple branches confirming aspects of her testimony with fresh analysis. At regional headquarters, officers had found conditions even worse than Maya had described. The cultural blindness she'd reported as systematic was now being revealed as institutional policy, embedded in analytical frameworks that had been standardized across intelligence platforms. But the most damaging revelation came from Operation Sandstone, where an investigative team had discovered that mission failure had been directly attributable to the exact dialectical misinterpretations Maya had warned about months earlier. 3 operators had been injured because intelligence analysts had misinterpreted cultural signals that local tribal leaders were actually using to warn of danger. Maya's phone began ringing constantly. Intelligence officers, military commanders, and Department of Defense officials, all wanting to speak with the woman who'd broken open what was being called the biggest intelligence vulnerability since the Church Committee reforms. She let most calls go to voicemail, but she answered when she saw Layla's number. "Maya, you need to be careful," Layla said without preamble. Intelligence Director Sterling sent security teams to the Language Institute this morning. They're going through files, confiscating translation materials, telling linguists not to speak to military investigators. Dr. Williams has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Maya felt her stomach drop. Dr. Williams, who'd spent 27 years fighting to incorporate cultural context into intelligence analysis, was being punished for Maya's courage. "They can't retaliate against him for my testimony. They're calling it a routine security review, but everyone knows what's really happening. Maya, they're going after anyone who supported you." David got a call this morning telling him his clearance was being reviewed effective immediately. The weight of unintended consequences settled over Maya like a heavy blanket. She'd known there would be retaliation, but she'd assumed it would be directed at her. She hadn't fully considered how intelligence leadership might punish those who'd simply been willing to tell the truth about what they'd witnessed. At the military compound, Maya found the atmosphere dramatically changed from the previous day. The hallways were packed with special operators, intelligence officers, and military officials carrying tablets loaded with revised operational frameworks. Operators who'd felt voiceless for years were finding strength in numbers, sharing stories that echoed Maya's documentation of cultural blindness. General Mitchell called for order as the session began, warning that disruptions would result in the briefing being cleared. But even the general seemed affected by the gravity of what was unfolding. This was no longer just a case about intelligence methodology, but a comprehensive examination of how institutional frameworks could fail the people they were meant to protect. Lieutenant Commander Rivera's first order of business was addressing the retaliation that had already begun. He called Dr. Williams to testify via secure video conference since he'd been barred from the compound by intelligence officials who claimed his presence might influence other witnesses. Dr. Williams appeared on the briefing room's large screen, sitting in what looked like his home office, wearing the same professional demeanor he brought to everything despite the obvious stress of his situation. "Dr. Williams," Rivera began, "can you describe the events at the Language Institute this morning?" At approximately 7:15 a.m., 3 security officers and 2 intelligence administrators arrived at the Institute with authorization documents requiring immediate surrender of all cultural context training materials, dialectical analysis frameworks, and communication records. They informed me that I was being placed on paid administrative leave pending an investigation into my oversight of unauthorized analytical methodologies. Maya felt sick. The phrase unauthorized analytical methodologies was clearly a reference to her cultural context approach in documentation methodology. Dr. Williams was being punished for the crime of confirming that Maya's concerns had merit. "Dr. Williams, in your 27 years as a linguistics specialist, have you ever been subjected to security review?" "Never. I've received commendations from the Defense Language Institute, recognition from multiple military commands, and awards for analytical innovation. Last year, the Institute was cited as a center of excellence for regional language training, specifically because of our staff's dedication to cultural context integration." The irony was devastating. Dr. Williams was being investigated by the same intelligence leadership that had recently celebrated his success, punished for the same cultural expertise that had made him an award-winning linguist. Lieutenant Commander Rivera's next witness was someone Maya hadn't expected: former intelligence analyst Patricia Chun, who'd worked in dialectical analysis until she'd been reassigned 18 months earlier for questioning established analytical frameworks. "Ms. Chun," Rivera began, "can you describe the circumstances of your reassignment?" Patricia Chun was a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who'd worked in intelligence for 12 years. Her testimony revealed a pattern of institutional resistance to cultural context that made Maya's documentation seem like just the visible tip of a massive iceberg. "I was reassigned for what my supervisor called methodological inconsistency," Chun testified. "But what I was actually doing was incorporating cultural context into communications analysis in ways that challenged established frameworks. Intelligence that was being classified as low-priority chatter took on critical importance when proper cultural context was applied." Chun described discovering that intelligence agencies had received multiple grants specifically intended to address the kinds of problems Maya had documented: cultural context training, dialectical analysis enhancement, regional storytelling pattern recognition. These grants totaled over $12 million over 5 years, but Chun's research showed that very little of this money had reached actual training programs or field operations. "When I brought these discrepancies to my supervisor's attention, I was told that analytical methodology was established by senior leadership and wasn't subject to field-level revision. When I persisted, I was told that I was creating analytical confusion. When I documented specific cases where cultural context changed operational significance, I was reassigned to technical systems analysis where my linguistic expertise was effectively neutralized." Maya listened to this testimony with growing amazement. She thought she was documenting isolated instances of cultural blindness, but Chun's evidence revealed a systematic effort to standardize analytical frameworks at the expense of cultural understanding while operators suffered the consequences. The briefing room erupted when Chun presented evidence that Intelligence Director Sterling had personally blocked implementation of a cultural context training program that had been specifically requested by 3 different special operations commands. Improvements that had been funded, developed, and scheduled for deployment until Sterling deemed them analytically destabilizing. Defense Intelligence Director Sterling objected repeatedly, arguing that Chun was a disgruntled analyst whose testimony was unreliable. But Chun's documentation was meticulous, backed by funding records, email communications, and departmental memos that painted a clear picture of institutional resistance. "Miss Chun," Lieutenant Commander Rivera continued, "Were you aware of Ms. Thornton's documentation efforts while you were working in intelligence analysis?" "No, but I wish I had been." Her cultural context approach would have provided the analytical framework that I was trying to develop within the system. Numbers and assessment reports don't show the human cost of missed cultural context. Ms. Thornton did what I couldn't. She connected analytical failures to operational consequences. The afternoon brought testimony from Major Sarah Kim, a combat surgeon who'd been treating special operators for injuries that she'd eventually connected to intelligence failures resulting from cultural blindness. "Over the past 18 months, I've seen a concerning pattern of combat injuries among operators deployed to specific regions," Dr. Kim testified. "Injuries consistent with ambush scenarios that intelligence had deemed low probability. When I started asking operations teams about pre-mission intelligence briefings, I began to see connections that were too obvious to ignore." Dr. Kim presented medical records showing operators who sustained injuries in situations that cultural context would have identified as high risk. The medical evidence transformed Maya's cultural observations from analytical concerns into documented physical harm. "In my medical opinion," Dr. Kim concluded, "operators deploying based on intelligence assessments with the cultural blindness Ms. Thornton documented are being exposed to operational risks that could be mitigated with proper cultural understanding. This isn't just about analytical accuracy. It's about operator safety." Maya felt the weight of this testimony differently than everything that had come before. These weren't analytical frameworks or procedural disagreements. These were soldiers whose bodies bore the evidence of institutional failures. Her documentation had captured not just cultural blindness, but actual harm to actual operators whose lives might have been protected with proper understanding. The day's most dramatic moment came when Lieutenant Commander Rivera called a surprise witness, former Deputy Director of Intelligence Operations Donald Harrison, who resigned 8 months earlier amid what were publicly described as personal reasons unrelated to his service. Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s who'd served in intelligence operations for 30 years, approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance. His testimony revealed why Maya's documentation had been so important. Military commanders had been systematically misled about the cultural context capability of intelligence operations. For years, we were presented with glowing reports about cultural integration, linguistic enhancement, and analytical advances, Harrison testified. Director Sterling's assessments were always accompanied by impressive metrics and success stories. We were told that cultural context was being fully incorporated into operational intelligence. Harrison described being given guided demonstrations of analytical systems that had been carefully calibrated to show cultural context integration that didn't exist in actual field operations. Command teams were shown analytical results that had been manually enhanced with cultural context for their briefings, then saw that enhancement disappear in actual operational intelligence. Ms. Thornton's documentation showed us what intelligence leadership didn't want us to see, Harrison continued. Her cultural context analysis was performed during actual operational planning, not during orchestrated demonstrations. Her observations came from spending thousands of hours with regional languages and communication patterns, not from automated systems designed to impress command teams. Harrison's voice grew angry as he described discovering the truth about intelligence operations. "We were told that grant funding was being used exactly as intended, that cultural training was being fully integrated into analytical frameworks, that resource constraints made it impossible to address cultural context concerns immediately. Every bit of this was false." The former deputy director revealed that he'd begun his own investigation after receiving an anonymous packet of field reports, operational after-action reports, in his mailbox 6 months earlier. His private research had confirmed everything Maya had documented and more. "I resigned from intelligence operations because I realized I'd been complicit in a system that was harming operators through willful analytical blindness," Harrison testified. "Ms. Thornton forced us to see what we should have been looking for all along." Maya was called back to the witness stand to identify specific communications and documents that other witnesses had referenced. As she looked through her carefully organized evidence, she realized that her 10 years of language teaching had prepared her for this moment in ways she'd never anticipated. Ms. Thornton, Lieutenant Commander Rivera asked, "Did you ever imagine that your documentation would lead to this level of investigation?" Maya considered the question carefully. "I hoped it might help a few operations get better cultural context. I hoped it might help a few operators get better intelligence. I never imagined that the problems were this widespread or this systematic." "What kept you going when you could have simply done your job and ignored what you were seeing?" Maya looked out at the packed briefing room, seeing faces of operators, analysts, and military commanders who'd been affected by the cultural blindness she'd exposed. "I kept thinking about a question one of my students asked me. Why don't they listen when we tell them the translations aren't right? I realized that I was one of them, and if I didn't try to fix it, who would?" The session ended with General Mitchell announcing that the Joint Chiefs had ordered a complete review of all regional operations, that the Defense Language Institute was conducting emergency assessments of cultural context training, and that procedural changes were being considered at every level of intelligence operations. As Maya left the compound that afternoon, she was surrounded by operators asking about her methodology, her motivations, and her insights. She deflected most questions, but one young lieutenant asked something that made her pause. "Ms. Thornton, do you regret coming forward given the retaliation against your colleagues?" Maya thought about Dr. Williams, about David's security clearance review, about the price others were paying for her courage. "I regret that speaking the truth about operator safety is considered controversial. I regret that protecting those who serve is seen as betrayal of procedure, but I don't regret ensuring that someone with command authority finally knows what's happening to operators in the field." That evening, Maya sat in her apartment surrounded by news of operational pauses and intelligence reviews, her phone buzzing with messages of support from throughout the military community. Operators in other commands were sharing similar stories. Intelligence analysts were organizing methodology review groups. Military language specialists were calling for comprehensive reform. But the message that meant the most came from an unknown number: "Ms. Thornton. This is Captain Michael Reed. The operator you mentioned yesterday who was injured. Thank you for caring about getting things right. Thank you for not forgetting us." Maya read the message 3 times, then saved it in a folder she labeled "Why It Mattered." Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more revelations, and more challenges. But tonight, she knew that a combat-hardened special operator would go to sleep believing that sometimes the system could change when someone cared enough to speak up. And sometimes that belief was enough to change everything. 3 months after Maya's testimony concluded, the transformation of military intelligence was both dramatic and ongoing. The congressional investigation had resulted in the reassignment of Intelligence Director Sterling and 4 other senior officials. The Department of Defense had placed regional operations under enhanced review protocols, and Maya Thornton, the language teacher who'd exposed systematic cultural blindness, found herself in a position she'd never anticipated: Director of Cultural Intelligence Integration for the newly restructured Special Operations Command. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 10 years of being linguistically essential but operationally invisible, she now had a permanent position with actual authority to create change. Her new office was in a renovated wing that had once housed Sterling's administrative staff that had been reduced by 60% as part of the Joint Chiefs Reform Initiative. Maya's first major initiative was something she called the Cultural Context Project, a systematic effort to document and incorporate cultural understanding into operational planning from the perspective of the operators who would execute the missions. She'd hired Layla Patel as her deputy director and David Chen as coordinator of regional integration. Dr. Williams, fully reinstated and promoted to senior linguistic advisor, served as the project's academic director. The morning Maya had dreaded and anticipated for months finally arrived in late January, the first deployment of Delta Force operators under the new Cultural Intelligence Framework. Maya walked through the operations center with Colonel Harris, marveling at the transformation her documentation had made possible. The Intelligence Fusion Cell, where cultural context had once been systematically filtered out of operational planning, was now staffed with linguistic specialists working directly alongside tactical planners. State-of-the-art cultural mapping technology displayed dialectical variations and regional storytelling patterns that previously would have been dismissed as irrelevant chatter. The briefing room where Maya had first testified now featured a wall dedicated to cultural context indicators, a visualization system that integrated cultural signals directly into operational risk assessment. "It's everything I hoped it could be," Colonel Harris sighed, his voice thick with satisfaction. "My operators finally have intelligence that matches their capabilities." Maya nodded, but her attention was focused on a communications panel displaying real-time translations from field operators. One caught her eye immediately, a cultural reference from Captain Reed, now safely deployed with proper intelligence support, showing a tribal greeting pattern that would have been missed entirely under the old framework. The congressional mandate had provided $180 million for intelligence reform across all branches, with priority given to special operations teams serving in culturally complex regions. Federal oversight would continue for 5 years, ensuring that funds reached their intended purposes. Most importantly, the mandate included provisions for ongoing operator input, including field team representatives on intelligence methodology committees and operator voice and cultural analysis frameworks. But the changes went beyond money and systems. The scandal had sparked a military-wide conversation about cultural intelligence that was resulting in training reforms throughout the services. Maya found herself testifying before congressional committees about the need for cultural context in military operations, consulting with other branches facing similar challenges, and speaking at military academies about the power of cultural understanding in frontline advocacy. The personal cost had been significant. Maya's relationship with some former colleagues never recovered. They saw her as a whistleblower who'd damaged the reputation of intelligence operations rather than someone who'd exposed necessary truths. She'd received anonymous threats, had her security clearance questioned, and endured months of professional isolation as intelligence leadership tried to discredit her methodology, but the support had been overwhelming. Maya's small apartment was filled with letters from linguists around the country who'd been inspired to speak up about problems in their own areas. She'd received recognition from military commands, special operations teams, and veteran organizations. Most meaningfully, she'd been invited to graduation ceremonies at the Defense Language Institute, where students credited her courage with improving their training and future operational impact. 6 months after the reforms began, Maya was approached by General James Mitchell, the Joint Chiefs representative whose testimony had confirmed her concerns. General Mitchell had been commissioned to conduct a comprehensive study of cultural intelligence capabilities nationwide, and he wanted Maya to serve as co-author on a report that would be presented to the National Security Council. "Your documentation methodology changed how we think about intelligence assessment," General Mitchell explained during their first meeting. "You showed us that cultural context isn't just about language accuracy, it's about the operational reality of people who live and die by our analysis." The national report titled Context Matters: How Cultural Understanding Shapes Operational Success became a landmark study that influenced military doctrine. Maya's cultural context approach was featured throughout the report alongside data showing correlations between cultural intelligence integration and mission success, operator safety, and diplomatic engagement. A year after her courthouse testimony, Maya was invited to speak at the Special Operations Command Annual Conference. Standing before 2,000 operators and commanders, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from language teacher to national security advisor. "I spent 10 years believing that my job was to translate what was said," Maya told the audience. "I thought good linguists worked around cultural differences, made the best of analytical frameworks, and never questioned operational decisions beyond their expertise." She paused, looking out at faces that reflected her own earlier experience, dedicated professionals working in challenging environments, supporting operators despite institutional constraints, caring for those who served despite analytical blindness. "But I was wrong," she continued. "Our job isn't just to translate words, it's to translate meaning. Our job isn't just to adapt to rigid frameworks, it's to improve them. Our job isn't just to support operators despite the system, it's to fix the system so that it truly serves those who serve us." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but more importantly, Maya received hundreds of follow-up messages from linguists and analysts who'd been inspired to document problems in their own areas, to speak up about systematic issues, to demand better for the operators they supported. Maya's impact extended far beyond military operations. Her story had been featured in leadership case studies about institutional change, academic research about cultural intelligence, and training programs about effective advocacy. The Thornton methodology of cultural context integration became a template used by organizations in diplomatic corps, international development, and other fields where cultural blindness affected operational outcomes. But the change Maya was most proud of was happening in individual operations where analysts felt empowered to incorporate cultural context without fear of methodological criticism. The reforms had included strong whistleblower protections, and the new intelligence leadership actively encouraged staff to document cultural concerns rather than filter them out of analytical products. 2 years after her testimony, Maya was invited back to Delta Force headquarters for a special recognition ceremony. The unit had achieved unprecedented operational success since implementing her cultural context methodology, with mission effectiveness, operator safety, and intelligence accuracy all showing dramatic improvement. Maya walked through the same corridors where she'd once documented dangerous cultural blindness, now filled with integrated intelligence teams, cultural context specialists, and the sound of operators receiving briefings that finally made sense of the world they were entering. In the unit's new Intelligence Fusion Center, built where the old analytical bullpen had been, she found a digital display showing real-time cultural mapping of operational regions. A plaque beside the system read, "In recognition of Maya Thornton, whose courage to document truth created the foundation for operational excellence." Her work reminds us that every operator deserves intelligence that respects the cultural reality of their mission. During the recognition ceremony, Maya was introduced by Captain Reed, now a major and the unit's intelligence integration officer. Reed had written his introduction himself, and he delivered it with the conviction of someone who'd learned firsthand why cultural context mattered. "Ms. Thornton taught us that operators should question intelligence when cultural reality doesn't match analytical conclusions," Major Reed said, looking directly at Maya. "She taught us that our missions should be as culturally informed as they are tactically sound. She taught us that someone who cares enough can change everything." After the ceremony, Maya walked through the Operational Planning Center, noting changes that extended far beyond the intelligence systems. New cultural integration protocols had been implemented, combining traditional intelligence with cultural context in ways that created truly operational understanding. Mission success rates were rising as operators deployed with proper cultural preparation, and casualties were declining as cultural blindness was systematically eliminated from operational planning. Maya's documentation had revealed how cultural blindness created operational vulnerability, but the reverse was also true. Cultural understanding had catalyzed operational excellence. That evening, Maya sat in her apartment, now a 2-bedroom space she'd been able to afford thanks to her permanent position, reviewing applications for the newly created Maya Thornton Cultural Intelligence Fellowship. The fellowship, funded by the Department of Defense, would support linguists in military units who wanted to advocate for better cultural integration but needed resources and institutional protection to do so effectively. As she read through applications from linguists serving with Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force Special Operations, Maya realized that her story had become part of something much larger than her individual courage. Military linguists across the services were finding their voices. Commanders were demanding cultural context. Operators were learning that their lives were worth the extra effort of proper cultural understanding. 3 years after her testimony, Maya received an unexpected phone call from Lieutenant Michael Parker, whose team had nearly been compromised by cultural misunderstandings during Operation Sandstone. "I wanted you to know that Parker's team just returned from the mountain provinces," he said. The new cultural mapping system identified exactly which tribal leaders were extending genuine cooperation. "We completed the operation with 0 casualties and full mission success. Our interpreter used your dialectical variation framework to identify cultural signals that would have been missed completely under the old system." Maya smiled, thinking about the ripple effects of cultural advocacy. A language teacher's documentation had become an operational methodology. A congressional testimony had become a tactical advantage that was saving lives and improving mission success. As she hung up the phone, Maya reflected on the question that had started everything. Why don't they listen when we tell them the translations aren't right? The answer she now understood was that sometimes they do when the right person cares enough to document the truth, find the courage to speak it, and persist through whatever consequences follow. Maya's quiet apartment now served as an informal headquarters for cultural intelligence advocacy, filled with correspondence from linguists, operators, and commanders who'd been inspired by her example. Her refrigerator calendar was no longer color-coded for different teaching assignments. Instead, it was filled with briefings, training sessions, and field visits related to her ongoing work with special operations teams across the military. The woman who'd spent 10 years being linguistically essential but operationally invisible had become permanently transformative. And the operators whose lives she defended had learned that sometimes when you ask the right question to the right person, the answer can change everything. 5 years later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Maya's new office at the National Cultural Intelligence Center, casting long shadows across the wall where her original documentation from the North Star operation hung alongside operational success metrics from 15 different special operations teams. Maya Thornton, now recognized as one of the military's leading voices in cultural intelligence, was preparing for what would be her most significant briefing yet, a keynote presentation to the International Special Operations Conference. Her assistant knocked gently on the door. "Miss Thornton, the delegation from British SAS is here for your pre-conference meeting. They're very interested in the call sign system you developed." Maya smiled, remembering the language teacher who'd started taking notes simply because no one else seemed to be paying attention. Now her cultural intelligence methodology was being studied and implemented internationally, helping special operations teams around the world navigate complex cultural environments with unprecedented success. The British delegation was led by Colonel James McKenna, a veteran operator who'd been tracking the global impact of what military strategists now called the Thornton Principle, the understanding that cultural context wasn't just supportive to special operations but fundamental to their success. "Miss Thornton," Colonel McKenna began after the introductions, "your work has influenced operations in 17 countries now, but I'm curious about something more personal. The call sign system, where did that come from?" Maya considered the question thoughtfully. What had begun as a small notation system in her cultural documentation had evolved into something that had transformed special operations communication worldwide. The system that had earned her the unprecedented distinction of being the only civilian ever assigned a Delta Force call sign, Rosetta, a name that had become legendary in special operations circles. "It started with patterns," she explained, gesturing toward her original notebooks displayed in a glass case nearby. "I noticed that operators were using standardized call signs that had no relationship to the cultural environments they were operating in. In some cases, the call signs themselves were creating operational vulnerabilities." Maya pulled out a tactical map showing a mountain region where cultural identity was deeply tied to naming conventions. "In this province, certain phonetic combinations are associated with specific tribal alliances. The standard NATO call signs were inadvertently signaling tribal affiliations that compromised operational security." She demonstrated how she developed a region-specific call sign system that incorporated cultural understanding directly into operational communication. Call signs that sounded natural to local ears while carrying embedded meaning that only properly trained operators could interpret. The system allowed teams to communicate in plain sight while moving through culturally complex environments. What began as a small adjustment to protect operators became something much more powerful, Maya continued. "We discovered that culturally appropriate call signs actually enhanced operational capability. Local assets responded more positively to communications that respected cultural norms. Operators developed deeper cultural intuition when their very identities within the operation carried cultural significance." The British colonel nodded with understanding. "And that's why Delta Force requested you specifically for Operation Nightshade." The call sign system had become mission-critical. Maya smiled at the memory. Operation Nightshade had been the turning point, the high-risk extraction that had transformed her from consultant to legend in the special operations community. Her cultural intelligence methodology had already proven valuable, but it was the call sign system that had made her indispensable. Nightshade was different. she acknowledged. The operational environment involved 7 distinct cultural groups with complex historical relationships. Traditional operational security protocols would have been completely inadequate. Colonel McKenna leaned forward, clearly fascinated. That's where Rosetta was born, wasn't it? Maya nodded, remembering the moment that had changed everything. The emergency briefing where Delta Force Commander Colonel Harris had stunned the entire room by announcing that Maya Thornton would be accompanying the operational team in the field, not as a consultant, but as an embedded cultural intelligence officer with her own call sign. Rosetta wasn't just a name, Maya explained. It was a functional role. Every team member's call sign incorporated cultural indicators that I could adjust in real time as we moved through different cultural territories. The system allowed operators to communicate seamlessly across cultural boundaries while maintaining perfect operational security. The success of Operation Nightshade had been unprecedented. 23 hostages extracted without a single casualty, moving through territories that intelligence had previously deemed impenetrable. The team had navigated complex tribal boundaries, avoided regional conflicts, and secured cooperation from local leaders who had historically opposed Western military presence. After Nightshade, everything changed, Maya continued. The call sign system proved that cultural intelligence wasn't just about avoiding mistakes, it was about enabling capabilities that didn't exist otherwise. What followed was the most dramatic transformation in special operations methodology since the creation of Delta Force itself. Maya's call sign system was adopted across all special operations commands, modified for regional variations but maintaining the core principle that operational communication should embed cultural understanding directly into tactical identity. Maya excused herself to prepare for the main conference presentation, leaving Colonel McKenna and his team reviewing the cultural mapping displays that now formed the backbone of special operations planning worldwide. As she walked through the corridors of the Cultural Intelligence Center, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from elementary school language teacher to the architect of a revolution in military operations. Her presentation to the international conference would be highlighting the 7-year results of her methodology's implementation. The metrics were staggering: a 73% reduction in culturally related operational compromises, an 81% increase in successful local cooperation, and most importantly, a 62% reduction in operator casualties in culturally complex environments. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the human impact of her work. They didn't show the operators who returned home safely because they'd been able to navigate cultural complexities that would have been deadly otherwise. They didn't reveal the diplomatic breakthroughs that occurred when military operations demonstrated genuine cultural respect rather than imposing standardized protocols. As Maya stepped onto the stage before a packed auditorium of special operations commanders and intelligence officials from 27 nations, she felt the weight of every call sign that had ever been assigned under her system. Each represented an operator whose safety had been enhanced, whose mission had been supported by cultural understanding that hadn't existed before she'd spoken up. 7 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. A Delta Force operator asked me a simple question that changed everything. He said, "Why do we use the same call signs in every cultural environment when we know that words carry different meanings in different contexts?" The audience leaned forward, many of them recognizing the origin story of the system that had transformed their own operations. That question revealed a fundamental truth that applies far beyond military operations, Maya continued. That identity itself, how we name ourselves and each other, carries cultural power that we ignore at our peril. Maya walked the international audience through the evolution of the cultural intelligence methodology, from her original documentation to the sophisticated integration systems now standard in special operations worldwide. She showed how the call sign system had expanded beyond tactical communication to influence strategic planning, diplomatic engagement, and international cooperation. What began as a simple linguistic observation has become a philosophical approach to operations in complex environments, she explained. We now understand that cultural intelligence isn't a supplement to operational capability, it's a fundamental component of it. As Maya concluded her presentation, The standing ovation reflected not just respect for her accomplishments but recognition of a transformative idea that had saved countless lives while enabling missions previously deemed impossible. The afternoon brought a series of operational reviews where teams from different nations shared their experiences implementing Maya's methodology. French Special Forces described a hostage rescue in West Africa that had succeeded specifically because of culturally adapted call signs that gained cooperation from local tribes. British SAS detailed a counterterrorism operation where cultural mapping had revealed alliance possibilities that traditional intelligence had missed completely. But the most powerful testimony came from Captain Michael Torres, a Delta Force operator who had been part of the original Nightshade team, the first to use Maya's call sign system in high-risk operations. Before Rosetta, we operated with a cultural blindness that we didn't even recognize, Torres testified. We were like people trying to navigate unfamiliar territory while deliberately ignoring the landmarks. Ms. Thornton didn't just give us better maps, she taught us to see the terrain itself differently. Torres described the moment during Operation Nightshade when the team had encountered an unexpected tribal boundary that didn't appear in any intelligence briefing. Traditional protocols would have called for bypass or aggressive penetration, both carrying extreme risk. Rosetta adjusted our call signs on the spot, he recalled. She incorporated phonetic elements that signaled diplomatic respect according to local custom. When we communicated using these modified identities, the tribal leaders not only permitted passage, they provided escort through territories that had been deemed hostile for decades. The conference culminated in the announcement of the International Cultural Intelligence Initiative, a cooperative program where Maya's methodology would be adapted for United Nations peacekeeping operations, international disaster relief, and diplomatic missions in culturally complex regions. As she left the conference center that evening, Maya was approached by a young linguist from NATO's Cultural Affairs Division. Ms. Thornton, the woman began hesitantly, I've been documenting cultural patterns in communications between peacekeeping forces and local populations. I've identified systematic misunderstandings that compromise mission effectiveness, but my supervisors say it's outside my scope of responsibility. Maya smiled with recognition, seeing her younger self in this woman's determination and frustration. What's your name? Sophie Larson. Well, Sophie, Maya said, handing her a business card with her personal number, I think it's time we talked about how documentation becomes transformation. My office, tomorrow at 9 a.m. The cyclical nature of institutional change wasn't lost on Maya. She had once been the frustrated linguist with observations that no one wanted to hear. Now she could ensure that the next generation of cultural advocates would have the institutional support she had been denied. The following morning, Maya arrived early to find Sophie already waiting, her arms filled with documentation notebooks that looked remarkably familiar. I've been tracking peacekeeping communication patterns for 3 years, Sophie explained as they settled into Maya's office. The standardized protocols completely ignore cultural variations and conflict resolution approaches. Maya reviewed Sophie's documentation with growing excitement. The young linguist had identified patterns in peacekeeping operations that mirrored the cultural blindness Maya had found in military operations, but with applications that extended far beyond tactical concerns. This isn't just about peacekeeping effectiveness, Maya observed. This is about fundamental approaches to conflict resolution across cultural boundaries. The collaboration that began that morning would eventually become the Civilian Cultural Communication Initiative, an expansion of Maya's methodology beyond military applications into humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and international development. 6 months later, Maya stood in the Pentagon briefing room where her journey had begun 7 years earlier. The room had been completely redesigned, now featuring a sophisticated cultural mapping system that integrated real-time intelligence with historical cultural patterns and regional dialectical variations. The table where she had once nervously presented her documentation was now the command center for cultural intelligence operations worldwide. General James Mitchell, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had called this special session to make an unprecedented announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, addressing the assembled military leadership and specially invited guests, today we formalize what has already become operational reality. The position of Cultural Intelligence Advisor is being established as a permanent component of the Joint Chiefs, with direct input into all special operations planning and strategic military initiatives. Maya felt a wave of emotion as she realized what was coming. The position they were describing hadn't existed before her documentation had exposed the critical gap between linguistic translation and cultural understanding. "It is my honor," General Mitchell continued, "to announce that the President has appointed Maya Thornton as the first Cultural Intelligence Advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the rank and authority of a 3-star general in all matters pertaining to cultural operations integration." The applause that filled the room represented more than professional recognition. It was acknowledgement of a fundamental shift in how military operations approach the human terrain of conflict zones worldwide. Later that evening, at a small private reception in her honor, Maya was approached by Colonel Harris, the Delta Force commander who had first recognized the operational potential of her cultural observations. "Do you remember what you said to me 7 years ago?" he asked quietly. "When I asked why you kept documenting problems that everyone else was ignoring?" Maya smiled. "I said that if I didn't try to fix it, who would? And now look what you've built." Harris gestured toward the room filled with military leaders whose operations had been transformed by her methodology. "You didn't just fix a problem, you created capabilities we never imagined possible." Maya looked around the room, seeing the faces of operators whose lives had been saved by cultural understanding, commanders whose missions had succeeded because of integrated intelligence, and linguists who had found their voices in a system that now valued cultural context as mission-critical. "The most powerful part," she reflected, "is that no one will ever again have to choose between doing their job and speaking the truth about cultural reality. The system now recognizes that understanding culture isn't optional, it's essential." As the reception concluded, Maya received a message from a secure military channel. Operation Aurora was preparing to deploy a complex extraction in a region with 7 distinct cultural territories. The message was simple but profound: cultural call signs approved. Team request, Rosetta to provide final review. 10 years after she'd first started documenting cultural patterns that everyone else ignored, Maya Thornton sat at her kitchen table with the operational briefing for Aurora spread before her. She reviewed the culturally integrated call signs with practiced precision, making subtle adjustments to phonetic elements that would signal appropriate respect in specific tribal territories. The woman who had once been just a language teacher now held the safety of some of the world's most elite operators in her hands, not because she had special tactical training or military experience, but because she had refused to accept that cultural understanding was someone else's responsibility. Maya's kitchen table had transformed from a place of frustrated documentation to the final checkpoint for operations that would have been deemed impossible under old methodologies. Her refrigerator calendar no longer tracked teaching assignments but instead showed briefing schedules with presidents and prime ministers who sought her expertise on cultural dimensions of international engagement. As she finalized her adjustments to the Aurora call signs, Maya thought about all the language teachers, cultural advisors, and regional specialists who had contacted her over the years, sharing their own documentation of patterns that institutional frameworks were missing. Each had found in her story the courage to speak up, to insist that cultural understanding wasn't just academic theory but operational necessity. The call sign system that had earned her the name Rosetta had expanded far beyond tactical communications. It had become a philosophy of operational design, a methodology for cross-cultural engagement, and ultimately, a revolution in how human understanding shaped military capability. Maya closed the Aurora briefing with a sense of completion. The documentation that had once been her lonely crusade was now standard operational procedure. The cultural understanding that had been dismissed as irrelevant was now recognized as mission-critical. The woman who had been told to stay in her lane was now defining new pathways for operational excellence. As she sealed the classified envelope containing her call sign adjustments for the Aurora team, Maya remembered the question that had started everything. Why don't they listen when we tell them the translations aren't right? The answer had never been about linguistics or intelligence procedures or operational protocols. It had been about courage, the courage to document what others ignored, to speak when others were silent, and to persist when institutional forces pushed back. For Maya Thornton, elementary school language teacher turned cultural intelligence advisor, the greatest achievement wasn't the systems she'd built or the methodologies she'd developed. It was the transformation of military culture itself, from an institution that viewed cultural understanding as optional to one that recognized it as fundamental to human security. And in that transformation lay the ultimate lesson of her journey, that sometimes, the most powerful force for institutional change isn't the person with the most authority, but the person with the most attention to what truly matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.